Build Your Business listeners. This is Matt Reynolds, your host for the podcast, and you are listening to what we are calling the legacy episodes. And really, these are the pre-episodes that really led to this podcast, the Build Your Business podcast. This is really my life's work and my brother's life's work in building your business. And so they were originally published in the Barbell Logic podcast as part of the Principles or Coaching Success series, but really touch on similar topics to the Build Your Business podcast: how to improve your productivity, how to set and accomplish your goals, deprioritize urgent tasks, to focus on what is most important to you, and most importantly, to become a better person and leader and business owner overall. I'm proud to bring you these podcasts. Again, many years of life's work, several years of podcasts, and several decades of business ownership. Hope you enjoy them and learn from them. You're listening to Barbell Logic,
the podcast where we talk about what it means to experience strength
and how you can use simple, hard, and effective strategies in training and nutrition to improve your life.
It starts with meeting you where you are right now and finding lasting solutions.
Welcome to the show. You're listening to the Barbell Logic podcast. I'm your host, Matt Reynolds. This is another episode of the Coaching Success series. Happy Friday. I'm super excited to have my editor-in-chief on, Niki Soli. I don't think he's ever been on the podcast. I was asking him. He said he was in one time in a hotel room when Scott and I were recording, and he said hi. But I'm excited. We're going to talk a little bit about what the process was like writing the book. So, hey, man, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's interesting to be on this side of the microphone for once.
Yeah, you've only listened to every podcast we've ever put out as the editor-in-chief, both the raw and the edited versions. And so excited to have you on. So we just wrapped up writing Undoing Urgency, the book that Forbes is publishing. You were the editor-in-chief. You've helped with the manuscript and helped write other books in the past. You know, you can name those if you want to. If not, that's totally fine. I'm interested in what this process was like and kind of walk through that. Mostly for people, one, that are just interested in like what it's like to write a book. And if they're interested, as they start to think about what they have, if they've got a thought or, you know, kind of a value-driven lifestyle or something that they want to get out to the masses in a long-form version that is certainly more than anything you put out on social media, and even more than you could do in a singular podcast, even a long one, even a 2-hour, 2.5-hour podcast, what that process is like writing the book. So let me just start here is like 30,000 foot view. What was it like helping me write the book, Undoing Urgency?
Yeah. So the first thing that people kind of get hung up on is they either think writing a book is impossibly hard or it's much easier than it actually is. And I've kind of seen both sides of that. As we were writing the book, the thing that I knew wouldn't be an issue is the amount of work that you would have to put in. Because a lot of times authors come, they want to write a book. They get somebody to help develop the manuscript, sometimes even write a good chunk of it, and they feel like they're done, right? They submit, a paragraph on what they want to write and say go. And that's really not what it is. It's a developmental editor, manuscript editor, whatever you want to call it, that I do. We're really just helping bring ideas out. And so the ideas have to come from the author, and it's a process. I mean, I know these last several weeks you were working around the clock. You were working harder than I was on the book as we were wrapping up a lot of the last pieces because it's your book.
Sure.
And that's one of the big things that people sometimes don't quite get, or they get stalled, right? And we talk about in the book, sometimes you need to create value first. And people, they wait, they think they want to write a book. They have this great idea and they wait and they wait and they wait because they want publishing contract. They want something else and they never get their ideas out there.
Yeah.
And again, with this book, you had so many podcasts out there already, articles, there was so much stuff to draw from. And all these ideas have been developing for a lifetime, really, but on paper in recorded ways have been developing for a very long time. So that's one of the things people don't do is they don't put the ideas out there. So for Undoing Urgency, that made this, very, very smooth process because we were able to tease out all the ideas, and a lot of it was organization and then figuring out how to communicate it best.
Yeah. I love that. And I should have done this first, but one thing that's really interesting about you is that you have on one side, on the coaching side, you have a kind of the standard background at Block. Like you've been working at Block since day one. You're an OG coach, excellent strength coach. But you and I have known each other and worked with each other even for probably 5 years or so before that, even before Block was launched. And so you started as a coach, as a lot of our, at this point, executives have done, and you had a special skill set. So you've got an educational background as an attorney. And so you've been our editor-in-chief for how long? I don't know. We've been a company for 9.5 years for probably, what, 7 of those, 6.5, I mean, a couple years in.
Yeah, I started as the editor-in-chief in 2018.
Yep.
Went out to your house that summer, fall, I believe, with the whole group. But that was very memorable. It was a lot of fun.
I remember.
That's when I started. Then I started with Block. Day one, I was there with Block. I've been doing that since law school. So I started out at a mentor in law school who said, if you want to clerk, which is something I wanted to do after law school, that's where you work for a judge. He said, you either have to do mock trial or write onto the law review. And there was no way I was going to do mock trial. You know me well. I don't want it. I never wanted to go to trial. Never wanted to be that kind of attorney. I don't like putting myself out there like that, but I do like writing. And so I bought a book by a guy named Eugene Volokov that was about writing onto the law review at your school. And I was the professional articles editor for a couple of years there on the New Mexico Law Review. And that's really where I started editing. And so that would have been 2007, I believe.
Yeah, it's been a while. Man, it's just been a joy having you as the editor-in-chief. Basically, everything that's been written, and you're not the only one that's written stuff, but everything that's been written has either been written by you at Block or has come across your desk and been signed off by you or copy edited by you or whatever. And so, as people see, I think the amount of content that we put out, written, video, and audio, you've had oversight of all of those things and total ownership of the written content that we put out, articles, ebooks, all that stuff. Even people have no idea the amount of work that you've done even internally with things like, we put together pitch decks or for proposals for military to make sure that they sound great. And all of those have a little bit of a different audience. You got to constantly consider the demographic that it's going for. The book was the same way. We had to think about who is the target audience for this, and you write it for the target audience. Now, I think the target audience for the book was a little bit easier for me because I am the target audience. So it's always a little easier when the author is speaking. Basically, I was preaching to myself a lot in the book, and it makes it relatively easy. But man, you've done a lot of work over the years for us for all sorts of demographics at Barbell Logic.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. It's weird how coaching and writing came together eventually at Block. I was coaching since about 2012. And for a time, that was kind of the thing I did because I wasn't making much money writing and I was backing off from practicing law in any way. And then, when you offered me the position as editor-in-chief, I'd written some articles and done some things, in the strength and fitness world. But that was the first time that actually came together and was, I think I told you shortly after that, it's like I had always dreamed about being able to write every day, but I was writing and I was coaching and I was doing other things. And really started in 2018, I started writing every day. We were cranking out a ton of content at that time. Yeah, and it's been just great. It's allowed me to really develop my skill in that way because, it's just like coaching. If you don't do it, it's a skill that'll fade with time. It's been a lot of fun.
So I want to dive into a little bit what our process looked like. And I'm also interested to hear some contrast, some kind of compare and contrast with the other books other authors that you've worked with. And so we had a really good idea of where this book was going to go from the very beginning. And that really grew out of that was a very detailed outline. So we had a super detailed outline. I don't know how long the outline is, but it's like 12 pages probably or 15. I mean, I don't know. It's long. And so we were able to break the book up. So Forbes reached out to us and had seen some of the stuff that we had done and was interested to see if we were interested in writing a book. And so I get a ton of sales emails and solicitors, all like literally probably 50 a day. And there was something about the Forbes email that just seemed legit. So we responded back and did a call, and then we're very impressed with their professionalism. And of course, Forbes has got a big name. And so, it's not, we had talked about writing a book for years and potentially self-publishing the book. And, you can self-publish and go right through Amazon, and it's a paperback and all that sort of stuff. And the concept of having a major publisher and being able to order offset printing, by the thousands of books so that it's a hardback and it's higher quality print, higher quality paper. You've got a full design team and publication team, publishing team that took your work and our work and the manuscript, and they were able to copy edit that. Of course, there was very little to do because that's what you do for a full-time job. As a matter of fact, I got to actually meet our Forbes copy editor a few weeks in Charleston. He was like, this is the easiest book I've ever edited in my life. And I was like, well, it's because my copy editors helped me write the manuscript. But then there's a galley team and a pagination team, and and that's where the book is at right now. But if we go back to the first thing we did before we started writing the book is we really laid out the outline and the chapters and the parts. And we actually had several conversations with Forbes about this is kind of how we plan on dividing the book up. What was that process like? What do you remember from those conversations before we even started to put pen to paper on the actual manuscript, that kind of first step?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the best things I think you can do is have to try to communicate an idea to somebody who has no clue where you're coming from. And that's what we had to do with Forbes first in a like a book proposal that was essentially a narrative outline of the book. Here's what we're going to say. And we can't use all the language that we're used to using, communicating to our audience who knows us so well that we have this kind of established language. You have to use, basic language, very, very clear. And that first process was really, I think, the beginning of a functional outline because you had to communicate it to somebody else in a page. And that was hard.
Yeah.
I remember just paring that part down. And then, we had some ideas about what might be the central part of the book. And that even shifted a little bit because as we were writing, it's like, oh, this is a little bit bigger than we thought. And then working from there to an outline, I'm a big believer in functional outlines. So, you can make them nice and pretty. They should be logically organized, all that, but it's got to be the thing that gives you the seed for actually putting words on paper. And so, yeah, our outline is a huge mess, still is. I think there's hundreds of unresolved comments and suggestions and things on there. And, but having us both work on it, you were able to see that there was all the things you wanted to talk about. And then I was able to try to kind of be the sounding board and, make sure that this looked like it flowed logically. And so I try to read it from the perspective of like, what is the Forbes editor going to think?
Yeah.
And lay that all out. And I think we refined that all the way until writing the last chapter over and over again.
Yeah, agreed.
But that functional outline is really key. And I think that's a huge part of getting things down.
Yeah, it's a great point. Our outline is a mess. It looks like a mess, but it's extremely functional. So it's when we say it's a mess that it doesn't look pretty, but it worked really, really well. So it wasn't such a mess that it was disorganized. It's actually extremely organized.
Yeah.
It's just there's comments and questions and points here. Like, is there a lesson to be learned here? Is there an action item to be taken here in this chapter or whatever? And so we started laying out the chapters. It's a 12 chapter book. It's 3 parts. And so the first part is really about undoing urgency, the problem of urgency, comparing and contrasting the urgent things in life with the important things in life. And again, the famous Eisenhower quote of, I have 2 types of decisions I have to make. Those are urgent and they're rarely important, and those are important or rarely urgent. And we really played off of that. Of course, Stephen Covey talks about some of that in his 7 Habits book. And then, of course, Brett McKay from Art of Manliness has written some articles on those sort of things. And so we've taken our spin on it before even the book. I mean, this was the kind of thing that we do in the business on a daily basis. And so we would look at chapter 1, like the problem of urgency, or I think chapter 2 is don't prioritize, deprioritize, if I remember correctly. And so what I would do, because I'm a better speaker than I'm a writer, and you are a naturally born writer, or at least a well-crafted writer. It's probably not fair to say naturally born because it's taken a ton of work. You're a far better writer than I am, is that we would start to lay out this bullet point outline for a chapter. And I've done a ton of travel the last 6 months. That's the other thing. So it's interesting that, often in a hotel room or at a resort or something, I would pull up the screen recorder from Turnkey Coach, actually, typically, and I would record as much of the spoken manuscript as I could, the personal anecdotes, like here's the stories that connect this lesson. We would identify what are the major lessons that we want to teach or communicate in this chapter. What are the action items for the reader? All of those things. And so I would record sometimes 20 minutes, 30 minutes, like it would, like some of those were long. And then you would take all that information from the outline and from the verbal, spoken manuscript, or as I walked through the outline and the anecdotes, as well as there were often times where I said, this is a great podcast that connects directly, and here's a previous podcast Scott and I did, or that's been on the podcast that will help, color the lens of this chapter. Yeah. And you would get to work on the chapter and you would write the first draft of that chapter.
Yeah.
And then send it back to me. Is that fair the way I've kind of explained that?
Yeah, that's how it would go. The great thing about the video is that would be in your voice. So yeah, a lot of times I would pull, I'd sometimes the whole transcript and I would just drop it into my chapter out. So I would always re-outline the chapter from my perspective after that, because one of the things I think I do well is I have a good kind of that legal mind of figure out logically what are the issues, where are the holes, what are the arguments we're making.
Yep.
So I'd re-outline it and then I'd drop pieces of the transcript into my outline. I might write blurbs to fill in or pull in other stuff. And so I'd re-outline the chapter, and then I would do what I call, my kitchen sink draft. The first draft, I would just put everything I could think of into it. And if I had time, I'd sometimes let myself get a little distracted looking up other topics. I had to read, a number of books that you would mention that I hadn't read before, or at least those sections of books so I understood them better. And that was how much time I had, I would spend doing that. And so that first draft, I'm a little bit protective of those first drafts because they're not good. And, I just put everything I can into it. And I've always said I'm a better editor than a writer. So if I could get what I thought was everything that needed to be in the chapter on the page, I knew I could work through it and edit it into something.
You could take your writer hat off and put on your editor hat, and then you could you could almost emotionally remove yourself from the writing and go, now I'm operating as an editor, even though I'm the guy that also wrote the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
And that's I was talking to my daughter about this. She was writing a speech the other day, and in her mind, the task was finish putting the words on the page about the speech. And then she's like, okay, I'm done. And I read through it. I said, you've got everything that needs to be there, but now you need to work through it and make it, instead of a speech, make it personal and connect to your audience. And I think younger people or younger writers, they see the task as getting the words down. And to me, that's the fun part. It's the easy part. And after that, you work through it over and over again. So you would usually see my second or third draft, but I felt comfortable sending it back to you because even though we have a lot of trust, there's, you have to be able to write and fail on those first drafts. And if I knew I was going to send you a first draft, it would really restrict what I could put down.
That's great information. And I'm even learning that, hearing this now. But it makes perfect sense. And so then you would send me whatever that was, the second draft, third draft, enough where you were comfortable with like, hey, I'm ready to send it back to Matt, the author, to look through it. And then we would, in Google Docs, then I would work through it and I would edit, mostly for voice and, not typically for grammar and punctuation and things like that, or flow, or if there was a paragraph or a chunk that seemed like it would fit better in this place instead of that place. And so that would start this kind of back and forth process that we would go from draft 2 or 3 to draft 4 to draft 5 to draft 6. And so usually by the time we got 5, 6 drafts in and back and forth, and of course there were less changes with each one of those drafts, then we would get to a spot that we go like, okay, chapter is in a really good spot. And then you'd say, okay, if you're done with your editing in Google Docs, I'm going to download it to Microsoft Word, and you're going to put your last final touch on it where you probably run it through Grammarly or what is your process there for the kind of the final piece once you're like, okay, he's done messing with it. How do we get it into final form for by chapter?
Yeah. So this is the part that Joel, our editor, probably appreciates is I have some experience, doing I call it the technical edit, but it's really making sure things conform to a style guide. So I don't know if you remember Joel telling us they use the Chicago Manual of Style.
Yep.
Which, has all the rules about grammar and punctuation and capitalization, all those things that
citations, all the stuff
people don't really care about until they notice things are inconsistent. And so, yeah, I'd run it through certain macros that I use for editing and also just the visual inspection. And that's the part I've gotten pretty good over the years at turning out stuff it's not ever going to be completely error free, but it's pretty close. And as close as, you can get to it without having a proofreader look at it, I think.
Sure.
But yeah, that's the technical boring stuff, but it takes some time. And that's one of the things I think people, when they're getting manuscripts ready and doing this thing and they get a list of all this stuff they're supposed to turn into their publisher, can be a little bit daunting because they don't really know what all the rules are.
Again, going to Charleston a few weeks ago and there were maybe 10 other authors there. And I kept thinking to myself, like, it became pretty evident pretty quickly that I had a great team, that the book wasn't being ghostwritten, that it was in my voice and in that I was writing the book, but that I had a team of support staff, not just Paige as our head graphic designer, Ted, the illustrator from Art of Manliness, and I'll talk about them a little bit more, but just had this great team working for me. And I could see on the face of the authors, like how daunting it would be, especially to write a nonfiction book, which is basically all Forbes publishes, all by yourself out on an island. So you're doing all this stuff. You're writing the manuscript, you're editing yourself, you're probably most of them don't have illustrations at all in them. We felt like the illustrations were going to bring the book to life. And I try to think about like, what would this have been like to do all of this all by myself? And so I think one of the big things I would say is if you're writing a nonfiction book, now it's a little bit different. You know, I've heard the stories of Stephen King going like locking himself away in a hotel room, basically, doing cocaine and drinking for, 6 months and writing a fiction book. That's a completely different process. And so a nonfiction book is very different. And so we started to have overlap. So we walked through the process of how we would go from the outline to a completed chapter. One of the things that would always go on is that as you were editing and wrapping up a chapter, I'm moving on to the next chapter. And I'm now recording the anecdotes and the lessons learned, the personal stories and the action items and things like that for the next chapter. And then, so when you get done with a chapter, you're ready to start moving into the next chapter and you start working on that, again, that very rough draft. And often maybe you were even working on like a late or close to final draft of one chapter and you're working on an early draft of another chapter. And then in that same process, I'm working through the chapter and I'm trying to identify what are some illustrations that will tell this story via, graphic design, illustrative, visual representation through the entire book so that it brings more life to the book. So it's not just words on a page, which I think are more important than the illustrations, but I wanted the illustrations themselves to tell a story. And so for the first 2/3 of the book, Ted from Art of Manliness, he did almost all of the illustrations and he was fantastic to work with. I mean, we could say like, this is my idea of what we want to show. And within 24 hours, I would have his version of a rough draft. And it was a rough sketch. I mean, it's a hand-drawn sketch. Like, yes, almost every time I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. And then he would clean it up and send it to me like, perfect, or let's tweak this tiny little thing. And so he was a joy to work with and fast turnaround. And then as we got into the final third of the book and working with Paige, she was fantastic to work with. But man, that's the first place where the book got daunting for me was we were building out these game plans and charts and graphs and tables and things that really need to be on there to identify. It's hard to explain and communicate via words what a very well-designed chart or graph or a game plan or whatever it looks like. So we would do that and do that as tight as we possibly could. As a matter of fact, even tighter than you would if it wouldn't be there in illustrative form. But for the last 2 or 3 weeks, the book was done from a copy perspective. It was written, but there was a lot of stuff that Paige had to put together for us. So I'm very grateful for her as well to do that. And that was the first time when I had to start writing sort of fake game plans, fake goals, actions, and metrics and execution game plans for, health and fitness for the general person or for financial freedom or whatever the thing was. And I think they came out really, really well. But it's interesting because we write game plans all the time in the business and they're so easy because we're so in the business.
Yeah.
But also we have this leadership team that writes a chunk of each one of those game plans. So you have a chunk that you have ownership in. It was very difficult for me to sit down and just write sort of a, in the ether game plan from start to finish. Here's all the goals. Here's all the actions. Here's all the metrics. Here's the execution plan, all that kind of stuff. And so that was the only part of the book that felt daunting. The writing never did. I think a lot of that is just because so much of this has been in my head for so many years. And I've talked about this before. Like if it's taking up bandwidth in my brain, there's a part of me that just wants to get it out. And I think it's a valuable lesson to learn. And so the writing process went incredibly smooth with you. I'm interested to know, as you look back now at the process that you and I used, how does that compare to previous processes that you used with other authors? And I'm sure on some you were just doing copy edits, some you were writing manuscripts. I don't know if you've ghostwritten some. How was it different? How was it better? How is it maybe worse? What would you do different in the future? I'd be interested in some of that compare and contrast.
Yeah, I actually in the future would probably do exactly what we did with other authors because I really liked having you walk through the outline and talk through it and being able to get the transcript from that and see, because that just made the whole process of getting words down on paper that sounded like you and I could really work from really smooth. So a couple books, I could talk about my dad's. I wrote some books with my dad, and that process was somewhat similar, except it was transcription. We would sit for hours. My dad's a preacher. He's been preaching since he was 15 years old and one of the best public speakers I think you would ever hear. That's his, medium of communication. So we would sit for hours and he would just talk and I would record, but we didn't have good transcribing services back then. So I would be there on my computer just typing as fast as I could and literally word for word transcribing, going, telling him to pause when I got behind. And then I would take that and work from that. So it's kind of like what we did, but a lot harder work
Right. Right.
at the outset. But it worked well. And, of course, my dad and I know you really well. So being able to work in your voices after that was much easier. Other processes, a lot of times I get the written something from the author, even if it's acting as a manuscript editor. So like I worked on one of Jim Wendler's books, 531 Forever, as just a manuscript editor. So that's a little different because he had written the whole thing and he needed somebody to just go through and make sure everything was reading consistently throughout. And, then I didn't follow on with like copy editing, proofreading. It was more read through, clean up kind of stuff. But when I get something that's already written, that can be a little bit more challenging because sometimes, when somebody's writing, Jim's a great writer, so that wasn't a real issue with him.
He's an English major, right? He's got a degree in English.
He's a fantastic writer and he had a lot of written material out there. So his voice was very consistent throughout. And so a lot of times it's just like, did you mean to make this choice or that choice as you work through it? But a lot of times writers, when they write, they don't write in a voice that's their own. They try to make it either sound, too posh and it doesn't sound like them at all. They try to use big words. They don't use the vocabulary they typically use, or they go the other way. And it's a lot of starts and stops. And it's just almost stream of consciousness on page. And working with written aspects of it without hearing it communicated in a natural form from the author, it can be challenging. Because when I send back, they're like, no, this isn't what I want at all. And it's because I was working with something that wasn't really what they were trying to communicate.
Yeah. Working with you, like we can't overvalue even the work that you and I have done together over the last 15 years. I mean, like I know your writing style and you know my voice. And so that made, I think, writing the copy so much easier. And the response from Forbes, and I want to be careful with what I say here, because I certainly don't want to count my chickens before they've hatched, but Forbes is like, guys, this book is unbelievable. This is a best-selling book. This book is going to crush. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll see when it comes out. But I think it came together really well. And I think, again, the primary reason for that is because of how well we know each other, how long we've worked together. You're an excellent writer. I know how to speak. I had all this stuff in my head already. I wasn't trying. Forbes talked about how often they've come to authors who are even well-known authorities in an industry. Would you like to write a book? You've got a good following. You've got whatever. And they're like, yeah, I think I would. And then they're like, I don't know what I would write about. And that is such a foreign idea to me. I'm like, are you serious? I've been holding this thing in for like 8 years. And I don't know, like you said, even really for a lifetime, but fairly refined for the past, certainly the last 6 or 7 years of the processes laid out in this book. And so it was like, yeah, let's go. We never got to a point where we had writer's block. Now I can see how I often wonder if writer's block happens more often in second and third books, as you get that big giant idea that you've been holding in forever. Like, dear God, just give me the soapbox to tell the story. I can do it. And then if it's successful, especially, and then the publisher comes back like, you know what, you need to write another book in 2 more years. And you're like, well, now I'm not 100% sure what to write on. And so who knows? I don't know what that's going to look like. But that process was easy and simple. And the other thing I think that's actually really helped us that I don't want to just skim over that you mentioned was what AI has done in the last year, 6 months or so. The transcription process is so clean. Dan can put it in the show notes. The transcription service that we use. Do you remember what it's called? The one that we use, but it was like instant.
Yeah, I don't remember.
It's fine. It's basically, it would transcribe an entire podcast or an entire video that I would make for you for like $1.75. The whole thing. So we're not talking about, it was just a couple years ago. Transcriptions were not AI. They were done by a human. And you would pay somebody, usually, in Ukraine, in Pakistan or India or somebody that you'd use on Upwork. And, and you could pay them a relatively cheap dollar per hour wage. They're not native English speakers. They typically are fine, but they literally would have to listen to what you would say. And just like you said, the way you did it with your dad, would have to type the thing out and then send it. And so the price was not prohibitive, but it was 10x the cost or 20x the cost of what it is now. Now a computer with these language learning models, they can just listen to your voice. They can even, they're pretty good at even putting in the inflections. The transcripts are pretty damn good. And they're going to get better and better and better. And so I would say if you're somebody like me who feels like you're better speaking and you can communicate a little better in the spoken word rather than the written word, that's a great place to start to get that manuscript down in transcript form. Now it's still going to be messy. It's still going to take a really good editor to work through it. But I'm sure it was much easier to do that than if I think about if we had to connect on Zoom calls and I had to talk and you had to record and type at the same time. Boy, that's a big pain in the butt. And so to be able to take those transcriptions, like you said, and had that early, like, just here's everything I could possibly put on this chapter. And it's kind of a mess, but now I can put on the editor hat and start to clean this up and take these blocks and these chunks of information and put them in the right order so that it's this logical progression of if this, then this. And if that is true, then this is also true. And then you can just keep walking through that. And so again, the company is called Barbell Logic because that's what the podcast was called originally, right? It was a logical, systematic progression through strength training. Now, that's not what the book is. The book is really a logical, systematic progression through life is really, I would say, and I don't think I've said that before or even thought about that, but that's kind of what it is. Every chapter builds on itself. And that's the other thing I love about the book. And I realize that I'm obviously skewed because I wrote the book, but I read a ton of books, but I read a lot I'd say 75% of the books I read the first 3 chapters and then I'm done and I close it and I go, I get it. The rest of this is just filler. It's not like I got the thesis, I understand, and I can apply. I don't need you to apply it practically for me. But I think with our book, each chapter builds on itself. So it's actually more like a series of math lessons where you can't learn the quadratic formula until you know how to add, subtract, divide, and multiply. And then you learn that, and then you go to the next step. Each one builds on itself so that all the way through chapter 12, there are new important lessons to learn. It's not just the application or the examples of the thing that we talked about in the first 3 chapters. And then there's 6 or 7 or 10 more chapters of like application and, different sort of lifestyles. And so I'm proud of that as well, that each one builds on itself to create a complete book. And then we tie it all nicely together, I think, in chapters 11 and 12. Yeah, I'm really proud of the way it came out.
My thought about it is, if you can write an article, but don't turn an article into a book.
Right.
We didn't write a short article and then repeat ourselves over and over and over again. It has 3 distinct parts. We don't repeat a lot. I hope it's enjoyable to read because you have some great stories in there. We try to make everything accessible and relatable, but there's not a lot of fluff or filler. It's useful stuff.
Yeah, it's been good too, because I've now started to receive the testimonials and the endorsements from people that we respect, people that everybody on this podcast would know. Their feedback is overwhelming. It's been overwhelmingly positive. And that feels good when, you send it out to 15 or 20 people that you very much respect. And they're like, bro, this book is fantastic. I'll use one as an example because I think he'd be fine with it. Like Dr. Pewter, I said, can I send you this book if it fits a testament? No pressure. Like if it doesn't fit your style or your core values or whatever. He texted me back the 4 quadrants with his own stuff, with all his tasks in it. He's like, I'm doing it as I'm going. He's like, dude, this book is amazing. And I'm going through it and I'm putting my own personal tasks. He had built out the 4 quadrants, had everything. Typed, like looked clean, wasn't just handwritten on a piece of, paper. And so my brother reached back out a couple days ago. He hadn't seen it. And I was nervous because it's very vulnerable. And there's places in it where it's like, there's some tough stories in there.
Oh, yeah.
And my brother texted me yesterday and he said, I'm halfway through it. He's like, this book is unbelievable, dude. He's like, he's like, I can't wait to get through the rest of this book. And so like, okay, this feels really good that the people that I respect the most in this world love the book. And because I didn't send it out to semi-celebrities that I've been on their podcast and don't know them.
Yeah.
Like Brett McKay got it because I know Brett McKay. He's going to fall into that celebrity kind of stuff. But like I've coached Brett and know Brett for 12 or 13 years at this point. And so these are the type of people who also aren't going to just blow smoke up your hind end and tell you it's good. And so if there's critical feedback that needs to come back, like I want to hear that, and we still have a little bit of time to tweak some of those things, but overwhelmingly the reviews have been positive. So, okay, let's do this. Let's tie it up this way. So for someone that feels like they have a unique message or value proposition, what tips would you give them in writing a book? And I know we've covered some of these things, but just kind of in a nice culmination that would help establish them as an authority in the field. And I think that's part of it, right? So one of the things I had to learn from Forbes is, look, this book is going to sell and sell well, but whether a book sells well is actually secondary to establishing you as Like I've been with, and I say this humbly, like I've been a relative authority in the fitness field or the strength field, certainly for a couple decades. But in the business and lifestyle and, I hate the term life coaching, but whatever you want to call it, world, I'm still relatively unknown. And they're like, what's going to happen is you're going to become an authority in that field. So for somebody that has a unique idea or value proposition, they want to establish themselves as an authority in a specific field. What are your tips for how to get started and how to start moving in that direction?
So first I'll put it in terms of the book. A book might be a long-term goal of yours, but it has to be driven by some bigger core value. And the success of that core value can't be tied to the success of the book.
Yep, that's right.
Right? The book is just a thing. So if you're putting all your hopes and dreams and thoughts and your success on a book being a success, you're probably going to be disappointed.
Yeah. Making millions of dollars.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's not going to happen.
That's not the goal. That's right.
There are those success stories. That's fantastic. But
yeah, but it's usually you're Michelle Obama or somebody and you get paid $2 million up front or $5 million up front to even write the book in the first place.
Yes.
For most of us, that's not that.
Yeah. And so, you have to know your goals. You have to know your values and why you're doing it. And if it is an idea that you really want to communicate, the most generative thing you can do is start communicating it.
Yep.
And sometimes that's personally, you just start writing it down. And the number of notebooks and journals I have with writings that'll never see the light, but have helped develop a lot of what I do, it's endless. I couldn't even count. But, if it's podcasts, if recording is the way you communicate it somehow and eventually communicate it to other people and start there. And that's the thing that will develop the idea and create value the most. And then when you're ready, you can start turning those things into a book. But if you're waiting to write until you have a book contract or all your hopes are on that big seller success, you're probably putting your focus in the wrong place.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to restate what you said to make sure I heard it well, because you put it in terms of the way we wrote this book, like the lessons that we teach in this book, is that even if you have a unique idea or value proposition, it has to start even higher than that at the core values of why you have that unique idea or value proposition. So our book is very heavy on core values in part one, like really identifying your core values in part one. And then the unique idea comes out and the organization of that idea comes out in part two as you start to build the game plan. The other reason this thing has been so easy, and a book is never easy, but it's a ton of work, but was because we had thousands of pieces of content we could pull from. And I want to be clear, this book is not a repeat of those things. We didn't take a bunch of the podcasts and transcribe them and put those in book form, which I've had lots of people do. And I've read their books and I've listened to all their podcasts. I'm like, this is just a repackaging of what they say in the podcast. That's not what this is. But because we had done all those action items and all those execution tasks, we had both, and because we had thought at a business level and a personal level about the core values, and we live as a value-driven life in my own personal life and a value-driven company, then we had both of the literal quote bookends of the spectrum where we had the core values in the beginning that laid the reasoning behind this unique value proposition or this idea. And we had completed hundreds, if not thousands of those tasks, those execution tasks and actions over the past, very consistently making content since 2017 at the business to help inform and fill out and color and drive that unique idea home. I think starting in the middle is the wrong place to start. I don't even know that starting at the beginning or the end is. I actually think in both. So there is a process that is described in the book of identifying what your core values are, and your core values don't need to be the same as mine, but then also identifying like what are the action items and the consistency of those action items and execution that I need to do over the next several years. I talk to a lot of millennials and Gen Z who want to be an influencer so bad, but they've never done anything. They've never accomplished anything. So like you said, at some point you have to just start writing about the thing or speaking about the thing on podcasts or making YouTube videos about the thing. And so you start with the little digestible chunks of that thing. And eventually that will develop into a cohesive, systematic, logical, full spectrum idea that then can be turned into a book.
Yes.
Not just regurgitated off of the actions that you've done in the past, but because those actions in the past have refined those ideas in your own brain. And so what's been great about having you as the copy editor and the helping write the manuscript is that you've also written and helped identify and help refine all of those ideas over the business over the last 9 years.
Yeah.
And so when it came time to go, like, this is the direction we're going to go, you knew exactly where we were coming from, both at the 50,000 foot view and in the trenches, getting dirt under our fingernails view. And I think that's why the value of the unique idea or value proposition really comes through, because we had both the 50,000 foot view worked out and the trenches pieces worked out.
Absolutely. Yeah. It made it very smooth.
Awesome. I'm not offering Nick's services. He's not for hire unless he decides he wants to be. But for those of you that are just piqued and interested in this, Nick, and are interested in just connecting with you and just being like, hey, I'd like to, this is an idea I have. I'd like to run with it. Can you send me in a good direction to start to learn how to do this? Or if they're interested in hiring you, listen, if you want a hyper intelligent attorney, writer, copy editor to coach you at Barbell Logic Online Coaching, what's the best way to contact you, to get a hold of you and just, shoot you a question or hire you as a coach, or just reach out and say like, hey, I appreciate that you did this?
Well, you can find me on Instagram. I have an account. I don't update it very often, but I check it. It's at Solini, SOLEYNNI, or you can find me at Barbell Logic. Check out my bio page.
Solin at barbell-logic.com, SOLEYN. Is that right?
There it is. Yep.
You would think I would know that for 15 years. That's why you wrote the book and I spoke it. I can say Solin, I just can't speak it. So, hey man, thank you so much for helping me write the book. I'm super excited about what the next 6 to 12 months look like. The book should be out, by the way. This is not a advertisement to sell the book. It was more about the process of writing the book. The book should be up on Amazon for pre-sale by September 1st, somewhere in that ballpark. The official publish date is December 10th.
Nice.
I don't pre-buy a lot of books 4 months in advance, so I don't expect to start like selling a bunch of books in September. You can also go to my personal website, which is ryanmattreynolds.com. And I've joked about this on the podcast before. You all know who Ryan Reynolds is. And Matt Reynolds is a Major League Baseball player. And we kind of share SEO there. And one of the things that Forbes said is like, you've got to own your name, and your name needs to. And so if you go in incognito mode and you search Ryan Matt Reynolds, it's nothing but me, which is cool because we've really started to skew that. So you can go to ryanmattreynolds.com and you can sign up for updates. It doesn't cost you anything at all. You put your email address in there, and then as the book gets closer and comes out, or I do public speaking events or do a roadshow tour for the launch of the book, we'll keep you updated on that kind of stuff, and you'll be the first to know when it's ready to go, ready for pre-sale and public publishing and all that fun stuff. So anything else? All good?
No, thanks for having me.
Awesome, brother. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been another episode of the Barbell Logic Podcast Coaching Success Series. And now you got a pretty good little outline on how to start to put together your ideas and write a book for those of you who want to do that at some point in the future. So I couldn't have asked for a better team to work with. So thank you, Nick, so much for the work you did on the book, as well as Paige and Ted and the rest of the team. And again, the whole content marketing and sales team at Barbell Logic, the support of the mission control team and the investors and people who let me take the time to spend, an enormous amount of time over the past 6 months, really since January of this year, getting this thing done. But it has been one of the great joys of my life. It's exciting to get your life's work down in a book. It's been really exciting. And so thank you so much for the helping through that process. And so if you got value from this podcast, we would love a 5-star review on the Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Tell a friend or family member. This is a great episode for people who aren't just super invested in fitness. This works really well for anyone who has a unique idea. You're like, I think you should write a book. Send them this podcast so that they can hear the process of how that might work and go smooth rather than less smooth. That's it. We'll see you guys next Friday. I hope you have a great weekend.